Ladies, gentlemen and MBs, once again I have some stuff to warn you about. In this video there will be discussions of a fictional sexual assault, including some imagery of that, and I will give you a specific warning of that closer to actually showing it, and there will be some hard, bloody violence. So, just be prepared.
Say the line!
Oh, there are a lot more of you here than there were last time. Arthur, King of the Britons. Where does a person even start with this? One of the most lasting and influential figures in all of Western culture. You'd be hard-pressed to find someone who doesn't have at least a passing familiarity with the Arthur myths. The characters and imagery are so strong that they have truly stood the test of time and permeated the popular consciousness. It's one of those things that you just kind of comfortably exists in the back of your head, and you think about it every few years when they do a new movie or TV show, and then once they're done you go back to not thinking about it too hard afterwards. My first exposure to King Arthur would have been this pop-up castle that we had when I was a kid. It was this big coffee table sized book that when you opened it up the middle was just this big pop-up castle, and it had 4 little storybooks in the corners. I looked at pictures again while I was writing this, and it is ludicrously cool. Like, I would enjoy playing with this thing just as much now at 28 as I did back then when I was 8. And I've liked the stories ever since. They're far from being my favourite thing, but they're just the right kind of fascinating to me that I look into them every now and then. This recently led me to think that I could make a video essay about King Arthur, because, you know, what is this channel for if not to scratch my creative urges by making content out of things that somewhat interest me? But Arthur is a big, tricky subject. There is a lot to talk about with it, and I really wasn't sure what angle to take. But I figured that if I just got on with the research that I would have been doing to understand King Arthur better anyway, then something would come to me. So I started reading. And it's my response to that reading we'll be getting to in just a moment, but before we do there are a couple of things that we need to clarify. The first is that there are people out there who believe that King Arthur was a real person, who was actually King of the Britons somewhere around the late 5th century. But for the purposes of this video, Arthur is a fictional character, and that is exclusively how I will be talking about him. Second is that I will only be using a limited number of sources for Arthur. I'm aware that we've created our idea of him based on a number of different texts by different writers across the centuries, but I am not a King Arthur scholar. I'm not any kind of scholar. I'm just a weird guy on the internet. So, if some of the stuff I say here is contradictory to texts that you know, then it's probably just because I am only one person with only so much time. Same for if I don't mention any of your favourite adaptations later on. So, with that out of the way, let's begin this journey with the most influential Arthur text of all. Incipit liber primus, Le Morte d'Arthur. I feel like it would be impossible for me to talk about King Arthur without mentioning Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur. Originally published in 1470, with the most recognised edition being edited by William Caxton in 1485. This is perhaps more than any other, the Arthur text. So much of what we understand about Arthurian canon is credited to this. But it's not actually where the stories originate. This is a retelling of the last 5 books of Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae, written sometime around 1136. And though a lot of the events and structure of that earlier text are present here, Le Morte d'Arthur is still its own distinct, separate thing with a lasting influence all its own. This tells the history of Arthur, from his conception to his death. Along the way, it tells of the many adventures of him and his knights. There are battles, quests, contests, the search for the Holy Grail, the love triangle between Arthur, Guinevere and Lancelot. There is so much iconography that we associate with the Arthur legends, and characters that have lasted centuries, ideas that are still used in fantasy literature to this day. I can't stress enough just how important this book is. But it's hard. I found reading Le Morte d'Arthur to be a fairly unpleasant experience. It's long, repetitive, dull, spends far too much time on unimportant details and glosses over the more interesting ones. To try and get this video done in a reasonable time frame, I pushed myself to read it in 2 weeks, and it was draining. Every moment of it is difficult to get through, and honestly, if I hadn't been reading it for the sake of this video, the chances are good that I simply wouldn't have finished it. But I get why it is the way that it is. It's old. The age of this text is key to understanding its difficulty. being written nearly 600 years ago, the concepts of what constitutes a written narrative are very different to what they are now. Instead of being a real story with emotion-driven characters and themes, it's just a series of things that happen presented completely value-neutral as though it's a history book. There are no descriptions of people or places, no adjectives to add flavour. It's just the beats of the stories without any of the connective tissue that would make them into a narrative. There are times when it just stops to list the names of all the knights who are there. Then came in Sir Gawain with his 3 sons, Sir Gingalin, Sir Florence, and Sir Lavelle. These 2 were begotten upon Sir Brandile's sister, and all they failed. Then came in Sir Agravain, Sir Gaheris, Sir Mordred, and the good knight Sir Gareth. That was a very knighthood worth all the brethren. So came the knight of Lancelot's kin, but Sir Lancelot was not at that time in court, for he was at that time upon his adventures. Then Sir Lionel, Sir Ector de Maris, Sir Bors de Ganis, Sir Blamor de Ganis, Sir Bleoberis de Ganis, Sir Gahalantine, Sir Galahodin, Sir Meneduc, Sir Villars the Valiant, Sir Hepes le Renard. All these were of Sir Lancelot's kin, and all they failed. Then came in Sir Sagramore le Desirous, Sir Dodinus le Sauvage, Sir Dinadan, Sir Bruin le Noir, that Sir Kay named le Cote Maltail, and Sir Kay le Seneschal, Sir Kay de Strange, Sir Meliot de Logris, Sir Petipas of Winchelsea, Sir Galaron of Galway, Sir Melion of the Mountains, Sir Cardoc, Sir Uwaine le Savoutres, and Sir Ozana le Cure Hardy. And this goes on for 4 pages. On top of this, there are moments of this book that are just repeated almost verbatim. 2 knights will meet while out on a quest, and they will challenge each other to a joust. They almost certainly won't recognise each other, and at least one of them will refuse to say their identity when asked. They shall feut with their spears, ride towards each other, one shall be smote from his horse. Then they will fight with swords for an hour or 2, before they give up and go back to one of their castles as best of friends. This happens over and over and over, and if it's not knights meeting while out on a quest to joust, then it's a jousting tournament where the book will detail every single fall. I really don't know how to explain just how much of this book is bloody jousting. There are iconic moments of the Arthur legends that we know starting here. They're just buried deep within these layers of inaccessibility. Because of the quite literally antiquated writing of the text, it's almost impossible to engage with anything that happens here on an emotional level. For instance, when Guinevere is on trial for treason because she sent King Arthur to the cookshed to bang the Chad Lancelot, and her lover has to ride in to save her at the last minute, that is a truly iconic moment that has stood the test of time. But it also happens 3 times within the space of about 100 pages. I can't think of any good reason to do a moment this important more than once, let alone 3 times. Everything in this book keeps getting undercut in these ways, and it's really frustrating to read. There is another issue with the age of this book that can make it quite difficult to read in some places. Now obviously a text written in the 15th century as an adaptation of a text written in the 12th century about a fictional king living in the 5th century is going to have some pretty different morals and beliefs to anything you'd expect to see today. It's pretty inevitable that some of it is going to come off as fairly unsavoury to the average reader. In the first section of the text, Uther Pendragon is completely enamoured of Igraine, the wife of Gorlois, the Duke of Cornwall, with who he is at war. He wants nothing more in this world than to do the sex on the wife of his enemy. Merlin the Wizard assists him in this by using magic to make him look like Gorlois so that he can go and sleep with Igraine while Gorlois is out on the battlefield. This is the conception of King Arthur, and it is rape. This is not a point that is up for debate. If you have sex with someone, and they think you are someone else, they did not consent to have sex with you. Igraine did not consent to sleep with Uther. King Arthur was conceived through sexual assault. This is an inherent part of the Arthur myth, and it's not really something that I'm comfortable with. Later on, after Gorlois has died and Uther has married Igraine, we get this particular exchange between them. "Sir," said she, "I shall tell you the truth. The same night that my lord was dead, the hour of his death as his knights record, there came into my castle of Tintagel a man like my lord in speech and in countenance, and the 2 knights with him in likeness of his own 2 knights, Brastias and Jordanus. And so I went unto bed with him, as I ought to do with my lord. And the same night, as I shall answer unto God, this child was begotten upon me." "That is truth," said the king, "as ye say, For it was I myself that came in the likeness, and therefore dismay you not, for I am father of the child. And there he told her all the cause, how it was by Merlin's counsel. Then the queen made great joy, when she knew who was the father of her child. So once she finds out that the guy who impregnated her through sexual assault married her later on, she's fine with it. She makes great joy, in fact. Contrast this to later in the book when Lancelot is enchanted into sleeping with Elaine. This is something that the text is very quick to lay judgment on as an affront to Lancelot's honour. So when a woman does it to a man, it's immoral and unacceptable. But when a man does it to a woman, it's just kind of fine and something that the woman ends up liking overall. Now I know what you're thinking. This is an issue of the book being a product of its time. You can't judge something written that long ago by the same standards as you would something written today. And while I do have to acknowledge that yes, the book was written nearly 600 years ago, I feel like I should point out, I am not reading it nearly 600 years ago, and it makes me uncomfortable. If I'm to do any kind of legitimate critical appraisal of Le Morte d'Arthur, then I have to be honest about how the book's lack of understanding of a woman's ability to consent added to my overall displeasure while reading it. Le Morte d'Arthur is not a bad book. It is a difficult, inaccessible book that is perhaps the very definition of hasn't aged well, but there is great stuff here that shines through, especially towards the end as the love triangle gets really juicy. You just have to get through like 900 pages of jousting first. But is there a way that someone could have made this more palatable? Could someone have taken the Arthur stories and made them as entertaining and moving as they had the potential to be? Spoilers, yes, that's kind of what this segue is about. Incipit Liber Secundus, The Once and Future King. The Once and Future King is a collection of novels written by T.H. White, consisting of 1938's The Sword and the Stone, 1939's The Witch in the Wood, 1940's The Ill-Made Knight, and 1958's The Candle in the Wind. I suppose there's also the Book of Merlin that was added into editions of it after 1977, but that was done after White's death when he'd already worked the important bits of it back into The Sword and the Stone for the collected edition, so he clearly wouldn't have been happy with it being published in the state that it's in, and so I don't care for its inclusion and I didn't read it for this video. Don't publish authors' works when they aren't finished. It's not okay. The best way that I can think to describe this is that it's a bit like The Princess Bride. In the book of The Princess Bride, the framing device is that William Goldman is taking this difficult old adventure story that his father used to read to him when he was a kid, and making it into something more palatable for a modern audience. The good parts version. Essentially, The Once and Future King takes Le Morte d'Arthur and makes the good parts version, writing it in a more emotion-focused style for a modern audience. I can't tell you how refreshing it was after reading Le Morte d'Arthur to read something that actually feels like a book again. What T.H. White did that was particularly welcome to me was he decided to use the Arthur stories to comment on what was happening in the world around him at the time, which was, you know, the Nazis. Original flavour too, not the new batch. The Second World War is inescapably woven into the text of these books. They were begun in the build-up to it, and finished reflectively after the fact. He saw firsthand what the war did to people and the reasons why they went to fight it. And I think it's safe to say, he wasn't a fan. The Sword and the Stones is an expanded version of Arthur's childhood, where we see him learning various lessons by being turned into animals by Merlin. Two of the most notable of these come from the Book of Merlin and were worked back into the earlier text. One sees Arthur joining a flock of wild geese. After he's learned to press Y to honk, he is put on watch duty, which he assumes will be to defend against any other rival geese. This is met with disdain by his new goose friend Leo Leoc. He was only meant to be looking out for predators. Geese don't wage war against each other because they don't have territories with borders. Only humans wage war against their own species, she contends. It's not exactly subtle messaging, but I don't think it needs to be. The other sees Arthur being put into an ant colony. The ants have a message constantly playing in their head to enforce the beliefs of the colony, to keep them working towards their goals without being distracted and thinking for themselves. But soon they discover that there is a bridge connecting them with another colony, and the messages start to change. A. We are more numerous than they are, therefore we have a right to their mash. B. They are more numerous than we are, therefore they are wickedly trying to steal our mash. C. We are a mighty race and have a natural right to subjugate their puny one. D. They are a mighty race, and are unnaturally trying to subjugate our innocent one. E. We must attack them in self-defense. F. They are attacking us by defending themselves. G. If we do not attack them today, they will attack us tomorrow. H. In any case, we are not attacking them at all. We are offering them incalculable benefits. So the answer, fascists? Again, this book isn't good because it's subtle about its messaging. Once he has become king, these lessons inform what kind of ruler Arthur wants to be. He thinks that a king should be just and fair, not starting wars over petty reasons or putting himself above his fellow man, but all while being an unelected monarch, which kind of flies in the face of any of these views, and it's complicated, okay? Building on Le Morte d'Arthur, where knights just kind of wander around getting into fights with each other, this contextualizes it with a reason. Arthur sees that the country has been working on the principle of might makes right, where anyone who is the strongest can just kind of do whatever they want because other people will fear them. Arthur wants to fix this, and he puts together his knights to fight against those who would use their might for ill, channeling their might into something more productive. Though it is perhaps less than ideal that the only way to stop people using their power to hurt others is to assert your own power over them by force, doing this, you have the potential to create a society where the very ones that you have charged with keeping the peace start to view themselves as superior to other people because they are doing this. They become as violent and evil as the very things that they were charged with using their might to stop, and they disproportionately target the ones who are weaker in society. All knights are bastards. The only way for Arthur to stop the noble goals of his system from being corrupted in this way is to slowly but surely phase it out and replace it with the idea of law. This actually works to give extra depth to Guinevere being tried 3 times. The first 2 are trials by combat. Because she has Lancelot, the strongest knight, on her side, she doesn't have to fear anything. Even if she were actually guilty of something, she would suffer no consequences because there's no fairness under the old style of law. Once Arthur has introduced his new law of fair trials, and Mordred and Agravain have found evidence of the adultery, then Guinevere is tried and found guilty. Arthur's new system of justice has been used against him, and he has no choice but to go along with it if he is to stand up for his beliefs. Suddenly, what felt repetitive and dull in the original feels like a powerful build to an exciting climax, where the beliefs of our main character will be put to the test in a very emotional way. That is what is so good about this book. It takes the events of Le Morte d'Arthur and reinvigorates them, giving them new clear meaning and themes. The characters have a greater emotional depth that drives their every decision in ways that feel really organic. It isn't without its flaws, however. There's quite a lot of casual racism, referring to Native Americans by a name that they don't like to be called, and a couple of times just straight up using the N-word. Also, the way that T.H. White writes Guinevere feels pretty misogynistic a lot of the time. Again, like Le Morte d'Arthur, I can view this as a product of its time, but can't forgive it for being that way. It is a bit more cushioned here though, because the rest of the book is genuinely really good, but it is something to be aware of. Reading these 2 books back to back like I did gave me a much greater appreciation for what T.H. White was doing here. He imbued the Arthur stories with the passion and conscience that they were previously lacking, and in doing so, created one of the most influential books of all time. You can still find elements of this in fantasy literature being written to this day, and you can see it in films like Disney's The Sword and the Stone or the musical Camelot. And he did all this while sticking fairly rigidly to the structure laid out in Le Morte d'Arthur. So what would happen if someone were to look at that structure just a little more loosely? Incipit liber tertius. Excalibur. Excalibur is a 1981 film directed by John Bowman. It is an adaptation of Le Morte d'Arthur, and it is
a dream to some,
a nightmare to others!
Just a whole lot.
I fight against myself!
Like, this is undoubtedly one of the most pure 80s cocaine movies I've ever seen, and I love it. It is squeezing in a lot from the book. Uther's War, The Sword and the Stone, and Arthur's Rise to the Throne, The Quest for the Holy Grail, the cooking, battling Mordred. It's a lot of stuff. Some might even argue that it's too much stuff, and that as a result, characterization falls kind of flat because everything has to be pretty rushed. Me, I would argue that. But to be perfectly honest, If you're coming to this movie looking for more fleshed out characters, then you're kind of missing the point. This is all about the ridiculous spectacle, which it delivers on and then some. Now, adapting this book into a film means that a lot of things are going to have to be changed. As I've said, there isn't really any consistent narrative to the book, and films need their reliable structures and arcs. So what the filmmakers had to do here was find a plot and an arc that they could bring to the film clearly. So obviously all the stuff with the knights pissing about on random adventures is gone, and good riddance frankly. The focus of this King Arthur movie needs to rest very firmly on the emotions of Arthur, and yet keep in the iconography that people would expect to see. This leads to some interesting structural changes. The biggest of these changes is the position of the quest for the Holy Grail. Now, the Grail quest is something I've barely mentioned up to this point because honestly, it's just not that important to the story, which sucks because it means I haven't been able to use a single Monty Python quote yet, and you know I have to at some point. But in Le Morte d'Arthur, the search for San Grail is just kind of a thing that happens. A bunch of knights, not even including Arthur, go out to look for it, face some trials of faith, 3 of them get to see it and they don't get to take it anywhere, and then everyone just carries on as if nothing happened. But this is one of the key things that people associate with the Arthur legends, and with Le Morte d'Arthur specifically. So it has to be in the film somewhere. So when they were writing the screenplay, John Borman and Rosmer Pallenberg had to find a way to give it some meaning. To achieve this, they add a really fascinating framing to Arthur's role as king here. Instead of just being a guy who is in charge by the divine right of having killed all the right people, he and the land are connected. Here, the land is a living entity, and its well-being is tied into Arthur.
You will be the land, and the land will be you. If you fail, the land will perish. As you thrive, the land will blossom. But why? Because you are king!
When he thrives, the land is beautiful and bright, and when he falls low, the land falls with him, turning dark and desolate. Arthur was never meant to be just a normal man, because he is the living embodiment of the land. So this movie puts all of the hardest moments of Arthur's life together, basically back to back. His wife is accused of adultery and Lancelot has to fight to save her while he stands as judge. Then they actually do sleep together, breaking his heart. His mentor Merlin is trapped in a magic cave, leaving him rudderless. Then his half-sister uses magic to seduce him into getting her pregnant. All in all, it's a pretty rough Wednesday for him. Following all of this, he gives in to complete despair, growing old and frail before our eyes. He is weak and the land is suffering for it, so the only thing left to do is to send his knights on the quest for the Grail. The one thing that can restore him and save the land. Because of this, seeing the knights out on this quest, watching their hardships and failures, and seeing so many of them fall to the hands of Mordred, magically aged up to be a Himbad, adds real stakes to this part of the story that are honestly lacking from both the other versions we've talked about. So when Sir Percival succeeds and the Grail restores Arthur to his strength, it feels like a real cathartic victory. Suddenly, the quest for the Grail isn't just a thing that happens for no reason, it's a deeply important part of the story. But the Grail quest isn't the only thing that they change to try and give more meaning to it. Another is the titular Excalibur. In Le Morte d'Arthur, the sword in the stone is not Excalibur, it's just a sword. He gets Excalibur from the Lady in the Lake later on. So the sword in the stone makes him king, the sword from the Lady in the Lake doesn't. But this movie wants to make Excalibur into this big, meaningful symbol, so it has to change some things about it. In this film, Excalibur enters the story during the time of Uther. He is at war with Gorlois and gets Merlin to bring him a sword to symbolise his right to be king. Merlin goes and gets Excalibur from the Lady of the Lake. Uther uses it until the time of his death, when he stabs it into a stone to ensure no one can ever use it again. So now, Excalibur is the sword in the stone, and removing it would have you chosen king because of its connection to the previous king. Once Arthur has removed the sword, it becomes the symbol of his duty and his strength. There's a wonderful moment where, to convince those who fight against him that he is worthy of his new position, he hands Excalibur to one of them to knight him.
You, Irians, will knight me. Then as knight to knight, I can't offer you mercy.
He willingly forfeits his power to a man he had already defeated to demonstrate that he will be a king who follows their ideas of chivalry and honour. The Lady of the Lake re-enters the picture when Arthur first meets Lancelot and battles him. Arthur loses his control in this fight, and in his fury, the sword breaks. If it's just that easy for Arthur to throw away the ideals he stands for in a temper tantrum, then of course Excalibur will snap with him. But the lady arrives and repairs it for him. A second chance with a clear understanding that this kind of power and respect has to be earned. By carrying Excalibur from that point, Arthur is signifying his intention to do right by the land for as long as he is able. But then the whole accusation against Guinevere happens, mercifully reduced to only one trial by combat this time, and he finds the two of them in the forest in their post-coital glow, and all the pain of this, the betrayal of his wife and his friends, hits him, and he loses his faith, leaving Excalibur in the ground between the two lovers, leading into his downfall.
The king without a sword. The land without a king!
Once the Grail quest is done and Arthur has returned to his strength, he visits Guinevere before heading to his final bout against Mordred, so that he can tell her that he forgives her, and that he could never really have been a husband to her.
I was not born to live a man's life, but to be the stuff of future memory.
She then reveals that she held on to Excalibur this whole time. Once Arthur has given up on his anger and his regret, he regains his power and heads out to his fateful battle, giving his life to save the land from his son/nephew. As he lays dying, the sword is returned to the Lady of the Lake, back from whence it came until such a time as the land needs another king to set it to rights. Damn, that sounded awkwardly pro-monarchy for me. But it's not my fault, it's just what the film is saying. There is one more element that they handled in an interesting and nuanced way that I want to touch on. As I mentioned, this film starts with Uther, so as you might imagine, you do get to see the Rape of Igraine. And this is where I will be showing some of the imagery like I mentioned at the start, so here's the timecode. If you want to skip past that, I will put a clickable version in the etc, and I'm just going to wait here for a few seconds so that anyone who needs to can get to that. Okay, here we go. This scene has the potential to be incredibly bad depending on how they frame it. It could have so easily come across like in the book where it seems to be justifying Uther's actions with its lack of condemnation, but thankfully this goes in completely the opposite direction and makes it repulsive. Because when you watch this scene, with the naked Igraine being assaulted by this guy in full plate mail armour, as his face changes between Uther and Gorlois, it is clear just what an unnatural moment this is. Uther already wasn't especially likeable before this, but this makes you despise him, as he forces himself on this woman. It's such a striking piece of imagery that I think will never leave my head, and delivers exactly the condemning framing that the book lacked. Also, I feel like I should mention that that's the director's daughter. John, why did you ask your daughter to... You wrote the script, you had to have known! Was Christmas not just, really awkward that year? And now, a brief palate cleanser, and treat for those returning to us. Oh no. Oh no, look who's in the video now. You didn't want this. Look who's in the video, gang. Yeah. Is that what you think? Excalibur does a solid job in recontextualizing elements of Le Morte d'Arthur to give them new meaning in a way that works on film. It takes iconic but not necessarily important elements like the Grail Quest and Arthur's Sword and makes them really matter to the emotional arc of its lead character. It showed further the potential of Le Morte d'Arthur and what fascinating things can be pulled out of it. But from this point on, our method of telling stories about Arthur changed. Suddenly, our approach to adapting Le Morte d'Arthur was to not. Incipit Liber Quartus. King Arthur the Brand. King Arthur has never really been out of the zeitgeist. It seems like every few years there's a new film about him and his knights, and if you're like me and watch a bunch of these back to back right after reading the books, then you start to notice just how much they drift further and further away from the source material as time goes on. We went from films that were trying to give as meaningful an interpretation of Le Morte d'Arthur as possible to ones that put almost none of it in at all. This is not necessarily a bad thing though, we already have our full fleshed out versions of that book, we don't really need another one. The way that it tends to work is that a film makes a big hit and the studios want to cash in on it, and King Arthur is a public domain property so it's a lot cheaper to make a film out of it, so they just make a King Arthur film that kinda feels like the successful one they're capitalising on. Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves was a big hit in 1991, 4 years later we get First Knight, an elaborate prestige drama with Richard Gere as Sir Lancelot and Sean Connery giving the most amazing acting moment of his entire career.
Why?
Gladiator was absolutely huge in 2000. 4 years later we get King Arthur, a historical fiction action film where Arthur is a Roman for some reason, and 39-year-old Clive Owen is paired up romantically with 19-year-old Keira Knightley, which is entirely gross. Also, it has the Murder Husbands in it 9 years before Hannibal, and you love to see it. Superhero movies are dominating the entire world? Well, how about 2017's King Arthur, Legend of the Sword, which will absolutely destroy Arthur purists before even finishing the opening text. Mordred, before King Arthur is even born. How do you get it that wrong, Guy Ritchie? But all those films are really wildly different. There are moments that we can recognise in all of them as King Arthur moments. King Arthur and Legend of the Sword both feature Sword in the Stone moments. First Knight is built around the love triangle and the fallout from that. We get recognisable characters from the books like Agravain, Tristram and Merlin, generally reimagined into new forms, regardless of the quality of the individual films, and good lord, Legend of the Sword is absolutely the worst. It's genuinely really interesting to see how the same characters and images can be used in such wildly different properties, fitting the needs of the current cinematic landscape. At this point, the imagery and characters of King Arthur are pretty much just a brand. They have become so divested from the original stories that they are essentially an entirely different thing now, with no particular identity to them. It's just a series of things that you apply to a genre to make a script more easily. In fact, the Arthurian imagery has been distilled to such a clear form that it gets applied to other properties as a kind of shorthand. Want to make this figure from Norse mythology's struggle for worthiness feel relatable to an English-speaking audience? Slap some Arthur on it. Want to give your demon superhero a worthy foe to battle against? Slap some Arthur on it. Want a fantasy setting for your 3D Sonic the Hedgehog game? Not sure why, but slap some Arthur on it. This is an Arthur slap. This is an Arthur slap. This is Arthur slap. Perhaps the pinnacle of this, taking Arthur imagery and characters and trying to work them into a new context where they feel wholly different to anything that came before, is a book that came out earlier this year. By Force Alone by Levi Tidhar is a reimagining of the Arthur legends, trying to reconstitute them for a modern audience. This book is trash. I mean, just genuine garbage. It's trying really hard to be edgy and dark, so King Arthur does swears and sells drugs. It's really violent and angry, and it's just so try-hard. To give you an idea of just what this book is like, let me read you a quick quote from it. "A sword in a stone," he says. "That is the dumbest fucking thing I've ever heard, Merlin." Then he grins and pats Merlin's hand. "Nice one," he says. It's awful. I mean, it's really awful. This is a book where Lancelot does kung fu, and the Holy Grail is an alien spaceship, and Sir Galahad, a himbo so pure that in Le Morte d'Arthur he was worthy of the Grail, runs a brothel. I'm all for trying to do new things with Arthur to make it more accessible, and I don't think you need to stick to the original stories to make that happen. I mean, that's what this video has kind of been exploring. But there gets to a certain point where you are so far removed from what the source material was doing that it feels like you don't know anything about what made the original good in the first place. And when we are introduced to Sir Bertilac the Green Knight via a scene of him masturbating, we might just have hit that point. But wouldn't you know it, I have a more positive example to close us out on, because there are some people who are still trying to approach King Arthur in an earnest way and to find what works from the original stories and apply them to today. Which is just a slightly roundabout way to say that you should watch The Kid Who Would Be King. This is a wonderful family-friendly film about a present-day boy who finds Excalibur and has the destiny that comes with it thrust upon him as he takes on a leadership position and saves the world from an evil sorceress. It's a modern Arthur adaptation that takes the imagery and a couple of the characters and applies them to a new setting, but actually uses them to speak to themes that feel like they come straight out of The Once and Future King. We see our lead character Alex given this sudden responsibility that he isn't ready for.
And I'm supposed to stop her. That's ridiculous. I'm 12. I'm not even old enough to do a paper round.
And the arc of the film is about how he grows into it, and it's brilliantly done. Gradual and entertaining with successes and failures along the way. It also uses this framework to talk about a complex idea that feels totally distinct from the traditional Arthur stories. Upon learning that he might just be descended from King Arthur, Alex sets out to find his estranged father with hopes that they'll bond over their shared connection to this greatness. But once they get there, he learns that his father was an alcoholic, who just left because he was a bad person. Alex has to come to terms with the fact that the image he held of his father in his head all his life was a lie by his mother to spare his feelings. He isn't descended from anyone extraordinary, he's just normal, and the only reason he has been chosen for Excalibur is because he is a good person who is worthy of it purely because of his own actions. Now, this is hardly extraordinary storytelling, although the bit where Merlin says that rich people rewrote the Arthur stories to make it look like only they could be worthy of being king is pretty great.
Written and rewritten, told and retold, sometimes by the rich and powerful, so they can hold on to power.
But it doesn't really need to be extraordinary. It's recontextualizing the ideas of Arthur, but staying true to the core of them, and I just think that's neat. Also, they fight fire skeleton warriors, so, you know. Liber Terminus. In the final book of Le Morte d'Arthur, after Arthur has died, we get this small section of text. Yet some men say, in many parts of England, that King Arthur is not dead, but had by the will of our Lord Jesu into another place, and men say that he shall come again. Some say that King Arthur is expected to rise again when the world needs him most. Any time now, mate. But really, he never left. The books and films I've talked about here barely scratch the surface of how many versions of the Arthur stories there are. We seem to just be utterly captivated by the idea of this one chosen hero, with a code of morals that he passes on to his knights, and a tragic death that can't be prevented. For these stories to have lasted as long as they have, we naturally needed to adapt and change them as we went along to fit in with the needs and storytelling trends of the time that we're telling them. So Historia Regum Britanniae becomes Le Morte d'Arthur, Le Morte d'Arthur becomes the Once and Future King or Excalibur, and they become so many other things. We reinvent these stories and these characters over and over again, and I love that. I can't wait to see what the future holds for King Arthur. I have no doubt that we're going to keep telling more and more versions of this story as time goes on. I mean, we're already getting a really cool looking new version of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight later this year. Maybe. No one knows what's happening with movies at the moment, to be honest. King Arthur will never leave us. I feel like for as long as we're telling stories, we'll be telling his stories. So we'll see more swords pulled from stones, more forbidden loves that rip kingdoms apart, more quests for more holy grails, and more strange women lying in ponds distributing swords as a basis for a system of government. Yes, I got there in the end! I would like to give an extra special thanks to my Son of Frankenstein patron, Chris Harper, and my Bride of Frankenstein patrons whose names are appearing on the screen right now. If you'd like to join these lovely people in supporting me, then head over to patreon.com/DavidJBradley, or click on the link that I will be able to put at the end of the video for once. That's nice. It costs as little as $1 a month, and you'll get early access to videos and exclusive content like bloopers, and once I reach $50 a month, I'm going to set up a Discord server for, doing Discord things. Be sure to subscribe and watch some of my other videos and stuff, I guess. I am going to awkwardly shuffle out now and leave it for the 20 seconds that it needs for the things to hover on, so